One thing a lot of people ask me is why I think the racial gaps in the US all told are around 80% a function of genetic differences. Why specifically that number? Why not 50%? Why not 100%? Why not 10%? I cited previously that intelligence researchers believe that the black-white IQ gap in the US is around 50% heritable, but I'm over here at 80%, not only with whites and blacks, but I believe that all racial relations are probably around this heritable in the United States. This video is not going to be dealing with schools, with nutrition, with test bias, IQ denial, race denial, etc. And I have 3 reasons for the specific number 80%. 1. The high general heritability of IQ inferred from twin studies. 2. Subtest heritability and race gaps. And 3. The increase of racial gaps with age. Now remember what we're talking about. I'm not talking about Africa or the interior of Laos or even the Arab world. Those places may have more environmental variation, and if there's more environmental variation, well, the environment is going to matter more. Also, environmental differences may play a bigger role between the United States and, say, Libya. On the other side, if you put everyone in a compound, gave them the same environment, then the differences between those people in that compound would be all down to genetic differences or pretty close to that. That's why when someone puts forth a heritability estimate, they have to say where and when. So first we can look at the high heritability of IQ within the United States, which is about 75% in adulthood based on 2 different kinds of twin studies and family relations studies. Now I have found that twin studies don't control for the reliability of IQ tests, and when you do this, the heritability is closer to 80%. So you have 2 kinds of twin studies. The first are twins reared apart, where the twins are separated ideally at birth, but maybe later, and we see how similar their IQs are compared to estimates of how different their environments are. So same genes, different environments. The same thing can be done with non-identical siblings reared apart, though that's going to be slightly less accurate because with siblings you have a kinship coefficient of 0.5 in addition to assortative mating of their parents. One problem with twins reared apart studies is that the range of environments is restricted, in that adopting families tend to be mid to high socioeconomic status, so you don't get the full range of environments that exist in the broader society that we're talking about whenever the twin study is being done. In 2007, MEWE et al. Looked at 409 adoptive siblings compared to a control of 208 non-adoptive siblings and looked at just how much their environments actually differed. And the first thing to note is that the environments were not as restricted as you might think. For an index of family functioning and parent depression rates, there was almost no difference in the ranges you get from adoptive and non-adoptive families. For socioeconomic status, while you get 82% of the variance you get in the general population, the adoptive families were 0.53 standard deviations higher in socioeconomic status and 0.33 standard deviations less likely to have disinhibitory behaviors. This would be substance abuse or adult antisocial behavior. And the adoptive families only had 59% as much variation as the general population in that. And so a major argument against twins reared apart studies is that adoption studies have a narrower range of environments than exist in the real world, and with fewer environmental variables, that means that a greater proportion of variance in adoption studies will be a result of genetic differences than is true in the real world. That you're getting something closer to a compound than what actually exists in the real world, or so the argument goes. Because a problem with this is that, at least when controlling for socioeconomic status, which social scientists like to do a lot because it's one of the easiest things to control for, we see that both in delinquent behavior and in IQ, the adoptive siblings don't differ at all based on parental socioeconomic status. Now, don't misunderstand what this is saying. This does not mean that parental environment doesn't matter. It simply means that poorer parents aren't producing any worse environments than richer parents, at least not to a degree that noticeably impacts either IQ or delinquency. The second method is twins reared together, and this is a better method in my opinion. What this does is it looks at pairs of identical and non-identical twins and sees how much more similar the IQs are of identical twins. You're looking at how much more similar in IQ people tend to be when they have an increase in genetic similarity of somewhere between 49 and 50%, depending on the strength of assortative mating. Of course, all these twin studies and family relations studies look at a lot more than just IQ. That's just the part we're looking at here. And the consensus on these is that by age 24, the heritability of IQ in the United States is around 75%, according to Wikipedia, and according to Robert Plomin, it's about 80%, which is the number I think it is. And always keep in mind that heritability increases with age, and studies, they tend to track people from childhood into adulthood. And so these studies, if they're looking at people under the age of 24, which they almost always are, they're going to have heritability estimates lower than 80%. So with all that background out of the way, I can finally make the first and weakest argument, which is that because the general heritability of IQ within the United States is 80%, our starting assumption for the racial gaps should be 80%. For the racial gaps to be less heritable than 80%, there would have to be some special environmental problem that blacks or Hispanics or whoever faces on top of the effects of a lower socioeconomic status. Because if there are no race-specific effects, then the racial gaps will have the same heritability as the general heritability of IQ. Yes, general heritability is not necessarily the same as between group heritability, but it's definitely the best first guess. Sometimes people will point to the example of plants in different soils as evidence that a high heritability within a group does not mean a high heritability between groups, but it's more like the soil and the lighting are sporadic, and that it's generally agreed that the soil and lighting gets worse as you go to one side. And we also know that the general heritability is 80% within the whole population that we're looking at. And so this picture here is more realistic analogy to the situation with humans in the United States. There's also the other problem that humans create their own environments, and that the effects of the environment of your own creation basically constitutes all environmental effects into adulthood. But that's something to talk about another time, which is that environment is not all it's cracked up to be. Now, think of it this way. You have general knowledge, and any specific application of general knowledge is going to be muddled as you go from general knowledge to a specific instance. But if the general heritability of IQ in the US is 80%, then any comparison between groups within the US should be assumed to be that in the first instance, and the burden of evidence has to be on the person saying that any specific instance deviates from the general number. And it has to be this way. Otherwise, anybody could just hand wave away the application of a general number. What would be the point of having any general knowledge if anybody could just say, oh, sure, that's generally true, but this is a specific instance. And so we cannot apply the general number to a specific instance because the specific instance could be totally different. The problem is that any instance you look at is always a specific instance. So you could literally dismiss the general number, in this case the general heritability, in any between group comparison or any comparison between individuals. So my first reason for believing that the racial IQ gaps are all around 80% heritable is that the general heritability of IQ is 80% in the US in adults age 24 and up. And the most prudent starting assumption for the heritability of any specific comparison is that it will mirror the general heritability for the whole population, and the burden of proof should be on anyone saying it deviates from this. This is obviously the weakest of the three arguments, but it establishes something that's going to be important in the next argument. The second argument has to do with age. The heritability of IQ increases with age, and this is just a function of people's genes being expressed more over time. Anecdotally, you can think about how little kids used to be blonde but grew up to have brown hair. When I was little, I used to have blonde hair, now it's brown. Males and females obviously get more different as they get older as well. For IQ, the heritability peaks and plateaus at around 80% at age 24. Bouchard's data here is a little bit higher than that, but it will work fine with what we're going to do. Next, we can look at IQ estimates by age according to Arthur Jensen and James Flynn. These gaps are in standard deviations. One standard deviation is 15 points. For example, Flynn and Dickens think the black-white IQ gap at age 12 is 0.63 standard deviations, which would be 9.45 points. This is useful because we can plot them on the same axis as the heritability estimate for the general population. Even though they're different things, it will give us some visually useful data. Now, the fact that Flynn thinks the gap is a lot smaller is irrelevant because what we're looking at is the pattern. Now, as for why Flynn and Jensen disagree on this has to do with how subtests are weighted and a disagreement on renorming samples. Flynn is in favor of using renorming samples. The hereditarians are opposed to using renorming samples, and this creates a systematic difference in overall score. But the dirty little secret, or perhaps not so much of a secret, is that this doesn't matter because the pattern is the same for both Flynn and Jensen regardless of the magnitude, and the fact that nobody really cares about nominal IQ scores because the IQ gap itself doesn't really matter that much. But that's a whole rabbit hole I'll go down in another video. For someone who talks about IQ all the time, here I am saying, yeah, but the full scale IQ doesn't really matter that much. We'll talk about that later. For now, we're just talking about nominal IQ scores. And what we see is that not only does the black-white IQ gap increase with age, but it does so in a way that scales almost perfectly with the increase in general heritability, which is evidence that whatever is causing the rise in the general heritability of IQ with age for the population at large is also responsible for the widening of the racial IQ gap, which is evidence that the black-white IQ gap is made of the same stuff as the variation in IQ in the general population. And that, based on the previously mentioned twin studies, is 80% heritable. So there we go. That's reason number 2 why I think at least the black-white IQ gap is 80% heritable. The third piece of evidence for the 80% number has to do with the heritability of the subtests. Some IQ subtests are more heritable than others, and this creates a natural experiment, because let's say that the racial gaps were 50% a function of genetic differences and 50% a function of environmental differences. In that case, we would expect to see the racial gaps to be the same on the highly heritable subtests and on the less heritable subtests. However, if the racial gaps were entirely down to environmental differences, that there was nothing genetic to racial IQ gaps, then we would expect to see the racial gaps to be smaller on the more heritable subtests. Because if the racial gaps are entirely a function of environmental differences, then a test that is more a function of your genes will have much smaller racial gaps. However, if the racial gaps were entirely genetic in origin, 100%, we would expect the racial gaps to be larger on those subtests that are more a function of your genetics. So, no need for false suspense. That's close to what we see. If the racial gaps were 50% heritable, we would expect no correlation between subtest heritability and the black-white gap. If the black-white gap was only 25% heritable, we would expect a correlation of negative 0.5. If the black-white gap was 75% heritable, we would expect a correlation of 0.5. And so we have these correlations, and you can look at the implied heritabilities from these correlations, and we get a median estimate of 0.789 and a mean estimate of 0.768. However, Rushton's number, Philippe Rushton, his numbers are a bit different, because instead of inferring subtest heritabilities from twin studies, Rushton's numbers are actually a correlation between the black-white IQ gap and how much the subtest was depressed by inbreeding in a Japanese inbreeding studies. And a lot of people may not like this number, and they may consider Rushton to be kind of a hack. And you know what? I'll go ahead and listen to you. Now, JF, something to keep in mind, this JF guy, he's also French-Canadian, like Rushton. So maybe it's time to go ahead and purge the French-Canadian influence on the race realist movement. So if we throw hack fraud Rushton's numbers out, we actually get a higher estimate for the heritability of the black-white IQ gap, one closer to Bouchard's general heritability estimate. But that's all just beating around the bush. All told, the results straddle around 80%. So to recap, the 3 reasons I think the racial IQ gaps in the United States are 80% a function of genetics are: 1, that the general heritability is 80%, and so the starting point assumption for any specific difference, be it between 2 individuals or between groups, should be the same as the general heritability number in the absence of any evidence to the contrary. If you have evidence to the contrary, by all means, but our starting point should be that the specific reflects the general. The second reason is that the black-white IQ gap increases with age as heritability increases with age, in a way that implies that the black-white IQ gap is made of the same stuff as the general variation in IQ, and that there is not some black specific environmental effects over and above the general environmentality of IQ. And third, the black-white IQ gaps are higher on the more heritable subtests, and the strength of the correlation is what you would predict if the black-white IQ gap were 80% heritable. Now, you may have noticed that I sort of take a leap from the black-white gap to all racial gaps, and that's true, I do. The best data of this is on whites and the blacks. And given that that mirrors the general heritability, there's no reason to assume, at least without any data to the contrary, that other racial gaps won't mirror the general heritability and the heritability of the black-white gap. Now, I have a request for the commenters that you don't get all up in here with race denial, IQ denial, find the genes, sort of equality of the gaps argumentation, or the 1,000,001 possible environmental explanations that I haven't controlled for. This video is just me explaining why I think the racial IQ gaps in the US are 80% heritable as opposed to some other number.